Dibrig tú go díon nó chánig tú go dtí an chathair seo, fuair his neart taithí agus d'urbar de chuid scileanna. I ngacháte éigean tú, fecinn tú rud éige na chabhraigh tú a thógáil, ach inis tá tú ag féchant ar an todhchaí, agus beidir go bhfuil tú ag smaoinemh ar an áit as a dagan tú. In éireann, tastaíonn pleanálathe, siúnéirí, ploméirí, díanadóirí, inaltóirí, altíirí, banistóirí láithreáin agus níos móhain. Tastaíonn túhain, le do chuid scileanna agus taithí go léir, chun cabhrúlinn na mílte tithe a thógáil. Tá an domhan tóga agat, a níos tar arás agus tógan teach a thóg tú. Tuile eolais ag gov.ie/Building Ireland. Teachtareacht ó rialtas na hÉireann.
This episode is brought to you by Paranormal Playback, a new podcast where hosts Cheshire, Mel and Laura recap the spooky and entertaining world of paranormal reality TV. Each week they take a fresh look at popular shows like Ghost Adventures and Kindred Spirits, blending humour with insight as they pull apart what's happening on screen. The three of them are a mix of believers and skeptics, which makes for really fun conversations, sometimes leaning into mystery, other times asking the questions viewers might be thinking themselves. With their background in creative production, they know how these shows are put together, so they're great at pointing out the moments that feel real versus the ones that might be more for the cameras. And their segment, This Old Haunt, digs into the true crime side of paranormal investigations, separating fact from fiction. With Halloween coming up, it's the perfect time to add something spooky, funny and a little addictive to your playlist. For even more spooky, ghostly, paranormal content with a humour spin, go check out Paranormal Playback. 1984. You're staying in a quiet cottage near the Welsh border. Thick stone walls, creaking floors and that deep countryside stillness. The house is calm until you notice a strange green glow coming from the living room. The computer, a borrowed BBC Micro, has turned itself on. You walk in, and on the screen is a message you didn't type and no one else is at home. In the autumn of 1984, a man named Ken Webster moved into a cottage with his girlfriend Debbie. The place was in a village called Dodleston, near the Welsh border. Quiet, old, ordinary. The kind of village where news still travelled by word of mouth, and neighbours rarely changed. The cottage, Meadow Cottage, needed work. It had thick stone walls, low ceilings, and a slightly warped wooden floor. But it was charming and historic, the kind of place people daydream about, an escape from city noise. Ken was a teacher, Debbie worked locally. For a while, they were joined by a friend of theirs named Nicola, who stayed during the early months of renovation. As autumn deepened into winter, life at Meadow Cottage settled into a rhythm. Ken and Debbie were focused on repairs, scrubbing down walls, repainting woodwork, trying to bring warmth back into the old house. It was the kind of place that always seemed to hold on to cold air, and despite being small, the cottage often felt too quiet. Not peaceful quiet, watchful. It was around this time they started noticing the first strange events. Cans of food neatly stacked into perfect little pyramids on the kitchen floor. Not knocked over, not spilled, arranged. Sometimes 6 or 7 high, balanced in ways that seemed deliberate. Debbie would wake up to find things out of place, small household items, spoons, bits of string, even the odd piece of fruit, moved from one room to another without explanation. But the most unnerving sign came in the form of footprints. They appeared one morning after a fresh coat of emulsion was applied to the utility room wall. A single line of chalky, dusty prints, rising straight up to the plaster. each foot with 6 toes. They weren't child size, they weren't massive, but they were wrong. Ken repainted the wall. The footprints came back. This happened more than once. There were no signs of forced entry, no missing keys, no muddy boot marks from outside, just those dust prints, and the feeling that somebody else had been in the room while they slept. At the time, they told themselves it was a prank. Maybe Nicola had done it for a laugh, or one of the neighbours had managed to sneak in, though that would have meant breaking in through the back and doing it all without leaving a trace. But Nicola denied it, and when the stacks of objects kept returning, and more prints appeared in other rooms, the idea of a prank became harder to believe. There were no pets, no children, no reason. Ken wasn't somebody who would jump to supernatural conclusions. He was rational, thoughtful, methodical. He had made a habit of documenting things, dates, times, the smallest detail, and slowly he began to keep track of every odd occurrence in the cottage, as if he knew something more was coming, and it was. By late 1984, the house was mostly livable. Nicola was still staying with Ken and Debbie during the week. There was a new addition to the house. A BBC Microcomputer that Ken had borrowed from the school where he worked. This was a sturdy little machine. British made, popular in schools, no internet, no modem, just a word processor and a few floppy disks. Ken brought it home to let Nicola use it for writing a comedy sketch. Simple enough. They kept it in the living room. When it wasn't in use, it was switched off. Then one night, sometime in December, something changed. Ken and Debbie were returning home after a short walk. As they came up the drive, Ken noticed a faint greenish glow flickering through the living room window. It was soft. The computer was on. No one had touched it. No one had turned it on. Inside, the room was dim, and on the monitor, a line of text. Not a system prompt, not a loading screen, but a poem typed out cleanly, as if it had been waiting for them. Here's what it said. True are the nightmares of a person that fears. Safe are the bodies of the silent world. Turn, pretty flower, turn towards the sun, for you shall grow and sow. But the flower reaches too high and withers in the burning light. Get out your bricks. Pussycat, pussycat, went to London to seek fame and fortune. Faith must not be lost, for this shall be your redeemer. No one recognised the writing. It wasn't a system file. It hadn't been left open. The computer wasn't even supposed to be on. They saved the file to disk, just in case, and the following morning they told Nicola. She hadn't written it either. None of them had. A few days later, another message appeared. This one wasn't poetic. It was directed, personal, and angry. What strange words you speak. You are a wordy man who has a fanciful woman, and you live in my house with lights which devil makes. It was a great crime to have stolen my house. It was signed L.W. The message signed L.W. wasn't a once-off. Over the next few days, more appeared. Always typed, always found on the computer with no sign of anyone actually having touched it. The language was strange, like English, but twisted. Words were spelled phonetically. The phrasing was off. Some sentences took a few readings to understand. Ken wasn't sure what he was looking at. He suspected it was some kind of Elizabethan English, early modern, but something about it felt personal. The messages weren't just cryptic, they were addressed to them, as if somebody had been watching from the other side of the screen. They asked questions. They referenced objects in the room. They commented on the couple themselves. Ken saved every message. He started keeping a log, dates, times, what was said, who was home. He ruled out the obvious explanations. There was no network connection, no modem, no way for anyone to remotely access the computer. And it wasn't always the same machine. Sometimes he swapped it out for a different school computer. And the messages still appeared. Eventually they replied. Ken left a simple text file open on the word processor. He introduced himself. He asked LW who he was and how he was doing this. The mysterious writer wrote back saying he lived in the year 1546. He gave a rough description of the land where Meadow Cottage now stood, then a field, near a river bend, with a track used by drovers to herd cattle. He said his name was Lucas, and he was terrified. He believed that Ken and Debbie were ghosts or perhaps demons, strange figures with glowing lights and a box that talked back. He called the computer Lem's Boist, a light box. He said it had appeared in his home, and when he tried to move it, it vanished. They were seeing each other's world, or parts of it, and it seemed that both sides thought they were being haunted. Over the next several weeks, Lucas kept writing. His messages grew longer, sometimes cautious, sometimes warm. He'd tell them about his routines, the animals he kept, the barley he grew to make ale. He talked about local customs and the changing seasons, the kind of things you'd only mention if you thought somebody might actually care. And Ken and Debbie did care. This wasn't like reading a textbook or a diary. This was somebody who they claim was from 400 years ago, speaking in the present tense, asking questions, listening, laughing, afraid. At one point, Lucas mentioned the year explicitly, 1546, the final year of King Henry VIII's reign. Lucas said he had studied at Brasenose College in Oxford, but was expelled after refusing to strike the Pope's name from a document. He was a Catholic in a Protestant time, educated but cautious, and now he was a tenant farmer under the powerful Grosvenor family, just trying to keep his head down. He described the computer, the Lem's Boist, with awe and suspicion. He believed it was part of God's plan, or possibly the devil's. He said it glowed like a lantern but without flame, that it made no sound unless it was speaking back. He could only see it at certain times, and he couldn't always tell if it was really there. For Ken, these descriptions were fascinating. The details Lucas gave, his speech, spelling, knowledge of farming, even the layout of the land before development, were remarkably accurate. And some of the language that he was using matched forms not easily found in 1980s reference books. Words and spellings that seemed to belong exactly where he claimed they did. But this wasn't just historical detail. Lucas had a personality. He could be witty, stubborn. He was deeply curious about the future. In one exchange, he asked Ken to describe their home, the walls, the size of the hut, the animals nearby. And Ken realised Lucas was picturing the very same building, but as it once had been, no electricity, no roads, no neighbours. Over time, something rare happened. The fear gave way to friendship. Lucas stopped calling them devils. He started referring to Ken as his goodly friend, and Debbie as the fair woman of the house. He even joked with them. In one note, he referenced a photograph Ken had left out on the table. A car. He called it a crude cart, for without a horse it won't go far. That detail shook Ken, because Lucas couldn't possibly have known about the photo unless somehow he had seen it. For months, Ken, Debbie and Lucas managed something fragile, a friendship stretched impossibly over 4 centuries. But Lucas's letters began to shift in tone. He was becoming afraid again. In one message he wrote that his neighbours had grown suspicious. They'd seen the strange light through the window, the glow of the Lem's Boist. They'd heard him talking to it. Lucas said he had tried to keep the communication secret, but whispers were spreading through the village. And in 1546, whispers could get a man killed. Then the messages stopped. For several days the screen remained empty. Ken checked it obsessively. Debbie grew tense. They had come to expect Lucas's updates like letters from a friend abroad. A friend they could do nothing to protect. When the computer lit up again, the message wasn't from Lucas. It was from somebody else. Someone in his time. A man claiming to be a friend of Lucas had taken over the communication. The message was panicked. Lucas, he said, had been arrested, accused of consorting with evil spirits, possibly even the devil himself. The devil's light had been seen in his home. His conversations with unseen voices had finally caught up with him. The local sheriff, Sir Thomas Fellhurst, had placed him under guard. The messages that followed were grim and strangely formal. At one point, Fellhurst himself may have dictated a note. It was brief, accusing the occupants of the light, Ken and Debbie, of trespassing in matters they couldn't understand. It was surreal. The language was cold, legalistic, and yet it sounded like something straight from the Tudor courts. Ken and Debbie didn't know what to do. There was nobody to call. No legal advocate for somebody arrested in the 1500s. No way to intervene. And then another message. Lucas, or rather the man he finally admitted he was, had been released, but only under house arrest. And that's when he revealed something neither of them expected. He told them his real name wasn't Lucas. That was a name he had made up to protect himself. His actual name, he said, was Thomas Harden. Ken and his friend, a local history teacher named Peter Trinter, went digging, and what they found was disturbing. There had been a Thomas Hallwarden, a scholar at the same college that Lucas had claimed to have studied in. Records showed he had studied there, had defied religious reformations at the time. Everything Thomas had told them matched. Just as Ken and Debbie were beginning to understand Thomas, the tone of the communications changed. A new message appeared on the screen, but this one didn't sound like Thomas at all. It was written in short, clipped lines. No warmth, no poetic phrasing, just an assertion. We are 2109. The sender or senders didn't explain who they were, only that they were now part of the conversation, and that Ken, Debbie and Thomas were all participants in something larger. Their first message was vague but unsettling. Try to understand that you three have a purpose that shall in your lifetime change the face of history. We must not affect your thoughts directly, but give you some sort of guidance. There was no explanation of what the purpose was, no instructions, no answers, only warnings. Ken was told not to bring in outside investigators, not to deviate, not to push too hard on Thomas's identity. We will interfere if we must, they wrote. Ken didn't like it. Until now, the strange correspondence had felt like something between people. Strange people, across time maybe, but still human. This felt different, controlled, like someone was watching not just the messages, but them. They tried responding directly, asked who 2109 was, what they wanted, but their answers never clarified anything. At one point, Ken left a list of questions, rational, scientific. He asked how many messages were appearing, if this was a time loop, a machine, a dimensional overlap. The reply was almost sarcastic. Questions, questions, questions. 2109 didn't want to teach, it wanted obedience, and it hinted more than once that it had been the one who gave Thomas the box of lights in the first place. But now the triangle was complete. There was Ken and Debbie trying to make sense of what was happening in the present. There was Thomas under house arrest in 1546, fearing execution for talking to ghosts, and now a third voice from 2109, observing both timelines, possibly even manipulating them. Ken began to wonder if the strange activity in the cottage, the stacked cans, the six-toed footprints, the feelings of being watched, had been part of a larger experiment all along, and if so, who was really in control? At this point, the narrative of the Dodleston messages had shifted completely. What began as a few odd footprints and an eerie poem on an old computer had turned into something vast and incomprehensible. A kind of triangulated conversation between 1985, 1546, and a voice from more than 100 years in the future. But for Ken, something didn't feel right anymore. The messages from Thomas had changed. They were less personal. The phrasing was slightly off. It was as if somebody else was speaking through him. He suspected 2109. He began to believe that they weren't just watching, they were interfering, possibly even rewiring parts of communication, editing or deleting replies, guiding the conversation in a way that served their purpose, not his, or Thomas's, or Debbie's. He tested this theory. Ken started leaving handwritten messages in the house instead of using the computer. He'd write a question and leave it on the kitchen table overnight, and in the morning sometimes there'd be a reply, scribbled in charcoal or chalk. No one saw it happen, but the handwriting was different, slanted, precise, as if someone from the past had found a way to bypass the digital interference. And the replies felt real again. Thomas confirmed his true identity this way. He spoke of his fears, his fate, his isolation. He said he had been warned not to continue writing, but he still did, because he considered Ken and Debbie his friends. In the same breath, he said he no longer trusted the man from the future. Neither did Ken. 2109 spoke in riddles. They described time as a dimension that changes shape. They implied that the experiment was not just a test of communication, but a test of trust, of cause and effect, of who would choose to believe and who would resist. There is no fixed reality, they wrote. You are part of a pattern, but the pattern shifts depending on your choices. Ken began to spiral. He questioned his memories, his motives, whether Thomas was even real. Was this friendship just a tool, a simulation designed to see how deeply human connection could reach, even across centuries? Or worst of all, what if 2109 had been watching from the start? After months of messages, hundreds of lines exchanged across supposed impossible distances, it all came to an end, not with a dramatic twist, but with a farewell. Thomas, or Lucas as they had known him for so long, sent one last message. It was gentle, thoughtful, a goodbye wrapped in hope. He wrote that he could no longer remain in Dodleston. The Grosvenor family, his landlords, had become suspicious. The sheriff was watching. The neighbours whispering. The risk was too great. He said he would leave the village quietly, travelling by boat to Bristol, and from there, back to the college that had once expelled him. But what he wrote next has haunted Ken and Debbie ever since. Thomas said that he would write it all down, everything that happened, every message, every conversation with his friends from the future. He said he would hide the manuscript somewhere safe where it might survive for centuries. And one day, he said, we would all meet up again. One day you will all sit down at my table for wine and mead by the river in Oxford, where we shall read each other's books and laugh, and talk of times that are no longer. That was his last message. A few days later, a final note appeared from 2109. No emotion, no warmth, just confirmation. Thomas left in peace. The book will be found. Then silence. No more messages, no footprints, no green glow. The house returned to stillness. Ken waited. Nothing came. He never found the manuscript. He never heard from Thomas again. After the messages stopped, Ken and Debbie went back to their lives, or tried to. They stayed in the cottage for a while longer. The computer was returned to school. There were no more footprints, no rearranged objects, just a quiet house. As if the last year never happened, but it had. Ken documented everything. He saved the floppy disks, he kept printouts, he wrote down dates, details, findings. Eventually he put it all together in a book, The Vertical Plane. It was published in 1989, small print run, little publicity. It drifted in and out of circulation like the story itself, half remembered, hard to explain. Skeptics tried to debunk it. They point to inconsistencies in the old language, suggest that somebody, maybe Ken himself, could have faked the messages. Maybe it was just a project that got out of hand. Maybe it was all invented. But if it was a hoax, it was a deeply strange one. It never made Ken rich. It didn't make him famous. He didn't sell movie rights or tour ghost conventions. In fact, he mostly disappeared from public eye. And if it wasn't a hoax, then something else happened in that cottage. Something that let a man from the 21st century talk to a man from the 16th, and let both of them be observed by something or someone watching from the future. There's still no record of Thomas Harden's manuscript. No trace of a hidden book buried in some library archive, waiting to be found. But Ken believed in it. Debbie too. They felt it. And maybe that's part of the story that matters most. To this day, no one can say with certainty what happened at Meadow Cottage. But if you're ever near the village of Dodleston, and you happen to walk past a small stone house on the edge of a field, maybe take a moment, stand still, listen. Sometimes the past doesn't stay where it belongs. Sometimes it types back. Thank you for listening to this episode of Scary. I had to cover this case because it's just so weird. And don't forget, if you just can't get enough of Scary, you can find exclusive episodes on the show's Patreon. The link is in this episode's show notes. But besides that, you can support the show by simply telling a friend or sharing the podcast out. Thank you so much to everybody who does. Join me next week for another episode of Scary.
Dibrig tú go díon ó chánig tú go dtí an chathair seo, fuair his neart taithí agus d'urber de chud scileanna. I ngacháte éigean tú, fecinn tú rud éige na chabhraigh tú a thógáil, ach inis tá tú ag féchant ar an todhchaí, agus beidir go bhfuil tú ag smaoinemh ar an áit as a dagan tú. In éireann, tastaíonn pleanálathe, siúnéirí, ploméirí, díanadóirí, inaltóirí, altíirí, banistóirí láithreáin agus níos mó uainn. Tastaíonn tú uainn, le do chud scileanna agus taithí go léir, chun cabhrúlinn na mílte tithe a thógáil. Tá an domhan tóga agat, a níos tar arás agus tógan teach a thóg tú. Tuile eolais ag gov.ie/Building Ireland. Teachtareacht ó rialtas na hÉireann. Dibrig tú go díon ó chánig tú go dtí an chathair seo, fuair his neart taithí agus d'urber de chud scileanna. I ngacháte éigean tú, fecinn tú rud éige na chabhraigh tú a thógáil, ach inis tá tú ag féchant ar an todhchaí, agus beidir go bhfuil tú ag smaoinemh ar an áit as a dagan tú. In éireann, tastaíonn pleanálathe, siúnéirí, ploméirí, díanadóirí, inaltóirí, altíirí, banistóirí láithreáin agus níos mó uainn. Tastaíonn tú uainn, le do chud scileanna agus taithí go léir, chun cabhrúlinn na mílte tithe a thógáil. Tá an domhan tóga agat, a níos tar arás agus tógan teach a thóg tú. Tuile eolais ag gov.ie/Building Ireland. Teachtareacht ó rialtas na hÉireann.
PNC Private Bank doesn't take unnecessary risks managing your wealth because we know that maintaining its integrity is important to you. But as humans, we crave a little adrenaline, so our advisors have some ideas.
Sometimes I book a hotel without reading the reviews.
Occasionally, when no one is looking, I double dip.
Once while driving, I came to a full stop for 2 seconds instead of 3.
However you get your kicks, just know your wealth will remain steady and secure with us. PNC Private Bank. Brilliantly boring since 1865. PNC Bank National Association, member FDIC.